Well, that pretty much covered it, really. It's cool and you should use it. All right, so prior warning, my wife is there who is super pregnant. So if I suddenly have to run out of here, if you know anything about Grid, you can just come up and take over. And it's probably a good analogy for parenting, really, because you don't know what's going to come next, but you can just roll with it. So if that happens and you know anything about it, you're Anton. All right, so Amy sort of gave me a bit of an introduction. I'm the one on your left. So I'm the Senior UI Integrator at Velpic. So it's a bit of a fun title in that it doesn't really mean anything. And so I do a lot of work around tooling, front-end practices, frameworks, React, kind of anything that's on the front end. And so if you want to talk to me about any of the stuff that I've brought up here afterwards, the one on your right is what my avatar looks like on Slack. So that's why that random cat is sitting there, and I just think it's amazing. So yeah, if you have any questions, I'm not super active on Twitter, but if you look for that cat, then you'll find me in the Fenders Slack channel. So I think this was a really good example, or a good thing of what CSS Grid actually is. It's a layout method designed for two-dimensional layout of items in a web page. So it sounds quite simple when it's said like that, and it's amazing that we haven't had this up to this point. So if you have used Flex, you'll know, or you might know that that's one direction or one dimension, right? You've got a main axis, and that's what everything runs along. Whereas in Grid, it turns out that we can now do things that go along both axes, and we'll show you with the demos, and hopefully that makes a bit more sense. So the most basic grid that we can have is essentially this, right? There's very little sort of CSS to that, and that's the result that you get. But before we sort of dive into that, there's a bit of terminology that comes with Grid that's important to sort of wrap your head around, and in particular is this system of lines, so CSS or grid lines. So everything that is between, and they can be horizontal or vertical. So they form the foundation of your grid, basically. Anything that goes from top all the way through and then all the way to the other side. And you can refer to them by number or by name, but we'll get into that again a little bit later. But it's kind of important to get an understanding of this concept of lines in Grid. So a track is anything that falls between two lines. Again, this can be horizontal or vertical. The cell is essentially the smallest unit that is available within a grid. So if you've ever used tables before or Excel, that's essentially a cell. And then an area is a group of cells. So here you'll notice that there's 4 there. So one thing I think that always disappoints people with Grid when they first start is you can't do fun things like make a T shape with the area, and that's always disappointing. So it has to be a rectangle. Just one of the limitations there. And I just want to, I'm not going to bring the HTML up in any more of the examples, but this is the HTML for all of the examples. And I think that that's important to understand because all of the layouts change quite a lot between each of the examples, but the HTML never does. All right, I might drop 1 or 2 cells in and out here and there just to make it even and look nice, and add a class just again to help, but the basics of the HTML is just that. Okay, so let's go back to the example that I had at the start. The new one is display grid. So if we're all familiar with Flex, it works in the same way. When you put display grid, everything that's a child of that container becomes a grid item. Okay, and then the next ones there are grid template columns and rows. So that sets the number and the size of the cells essentially. So there's 3 by 3 at 100 pixels. Okay, and the grid gap, so that's the size, oh sorry, I'm going to jump back. There is shorthand syntax for that middle section. It introduces some new, it basically introduces a slash when you do that. If you've used SAS or anything that's mathematical, that initially can be a bit weird. You think you're dividing something. So I'm just going to ignore the shorthand, and if you're interested in using shorthand, then definitely have a look at that. But at the start, I find it's a bit easier to be more explicit about what you're actually doing. Columns, rows, do all of that. And then the gap sets the size of if you've used something like a Bootstrap or something like that, gutters, so tables have the gutters and things like that. It's the same concept here. So a lot of it's quite transferable. So that's pretty interesting if you're making a very static gallery. So that's probably not sold you yet on the benefit of using Grid. But along with Grid and those properties that I mentioned before, come a whole lot of new units and new functions that are going to enable us to make very fluid, dynamic layouts. So the first one is called fraction, or FR. So it's the same example before, again, same HTML. And all I've added here is I've changed my columns to using one FR. And then so what it's doing now is stretching each one of those to take up an equal amount of space in that area. Okay, so that gives us a bit of, if your screen's really wide or mobile, it'll be a fraction of that. So you'll notice each time I'm doing this, I'm having to repeat the sizes over and over again. If you have, again, if you're using something like a grid framework like Bootstrap or whatever, any of those guys, you know that the basics is around 12. So if you had to write one fraction 12 times, I know there's copy and paste and keyboard shortcuts and it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, but it would get repetitive. Okay, so what they've introduced is the repeat method or function. So what that looks like is down the bottom there, repeat. So I'm saying I want it to repeat 3 times, one fraction. Okay, so I could, and this basically redoes any of the 12 column grids. Repeat 12, one fraction, you set the gap, and there you go. That's it. You've just replaced basically all of the, the flex-based layouts. And then the bottom one as well, I've mixed it in with the others. So the danger of just continually using those fractions is obviously one fraction of a mobile screen could get quite tiny. So another one thing that's been introduced is the minmax function. So it sets the size no smaller than a minimum and no greater than the maximum for that cell. So you can go a long way, and I didn't quite have time to put that into this talk today, but you can actually get a long way with this one without needing media queries at all. So on this page, we'll see that, again, I've just done my thing. I'm repeating it 3 times. The min-max is, or the minimum is 200. The maximum is one fraction. So you'll notice when I get to a certain point, it just stops and locks in. Obviously, that's not great responsiveness, but it's just showing the example here of what happens when it gets to that point. And then when I'm going the other way, once it's over 200, it just sort of lets it go and flows out from there. So in each of these examples, I've used just one of those sort of sizes and things, but you're not limited to just using repeat, just using that, or just using the fractions. You can mix and match as you please. So in this example here, we've used pixels, repeats, fractions, min-max, percentages, and rems. I'm not sure you would do this. I'm just saying that you can do this. Hands up here, anyone who's old enough to remember table-based layouts. Thank goodness, because I was worried I was going to be the only one with my hand up. All right, so you might be looking at this and having an initial thought of, that looks very similar to that. And I guess in a way it is similar to that, except it's awesome. Because go back again to the HTML, if you keep that in your mind, this is it. That's doing all of that. And it's just a few lines of code there for the CSS and a whole bunch for the HTML. But so simple to do that. You haven't polluted your HTML with tables, table rows, all of that. If you're not old enough to have done that, then you're in a good age anyway, so you have nothing to complain about. Yeah, so some further reading. So that's basically how we laid out the grid as a whole. So some really good further reading on that is looking at span, so grid column span. That lets you, instead of defining it each time. You can just say just span 3 or just do something with that. And the second one I think is really cool because that's the one I was talking about, that you can essentially get away with not needing media queries. You can just tell it to auto or auto fit in that area there. And auto rows and columns, I use that a little bit later, but it's essentially creating an implicit grid. So each time I did that, I defined the rows and the columns. If you're just wanting the columns, you can set the rows to auto, and it's just implicit as it goes down. So we want to dive now into a little bit more of positioning areas. And I think this is where you'll start to see how good Grid is for laying out things. Again, I'll remind you that the HTML is the same. So this is positioning an area within a grid. So this is our first cell from there. We've got grid column 1-3. So there's that dash syntax that I was mentioning before. And the grid row is also 1 and 3. Initially, when I looked at that, I thought, what is that doing? It didn't make sense to me. And if anyone uses Firefox, they'll probably be familiar with the work they've been doing in the dev tools for Grid. So this really helped me understand it, because one thing, if you've done any sort of array programming, you'll know that everything starts at 0. And this doesn't, and I don't know why, and it was really annoying. But if you go into Firefox, this isn't Firefox, I've drawn this, you will get something like this when it shows you. So it will show you the count, 1, 2. So these are the lines coming back again. When you're working with Grid, you're working with the lines, not necessarily the cells within there. So 1 over to the third line. So I'm telling it to start at number 1 and end at number 3. And then likewise the other way, start at number 1, end at number 3. So it's just a little bit of a difference there. And one of the best things I think that this enables is the ability to overlap elements. So again, the HTML is exactly the same. And you'll know that if you've ever had a design where there's this thing that starts in the hero or the header, goes right through the content and is still going into the footer, you just go, oh, I don't know how to do that. And you just tell them, oh, just bump it up so it's not overlapping the footer and we'll all be good. But we can now just do that. And all you've got to tell that thing to do is start, say, at 1 and go all the way to 4, or in this case, 2 is overlapping 1 and 7 is overlapping 2. And it was just that simple. Again, this is the entire code that sets that up. So you'll notice the grey ones, what they're doing is just filling in the space that's available. All right? So it makes it really, if you tried to do this with other things, you would end in some nightmare of things breaking out of browsers and what have you. All right, so again, 1 and 3, 1 and 3, and there's your counting there. So originally I was a little hesitant to include this example because I think with Grid, this will no longer be the holy grail of designs, but it does form a good example of why everyone is so excited about Grid. Okay, because with what you've just seen there before, you're not just going to be doing those holy grail things top, side, bottom. You're going to be making designs that do a whole lot more than that. But it does form a good example because it's what we're all used to doing now, and we're used to the things of everything breaking. So that's this one. So you'll be familiar with that, with the header up the top, the sidebar and the footer. And if you've ever tried to do this, inevitably something overlaps something in Internet Explorer. And so that, again, that's it. That's all that it takes to achieve this with Grid. So we define our grid at the top, we're using the repeat, and here's that auto that I was telling you about, so I'm just being implicit with the rest of it. All right, and then I position each one of them where I want them, and then the others fill in the available space that's there. But when you're using these numbers, it's still a little bit weird, right? Like, what is 1 and 4 kind of referring to? Or what if inevitably the client will say, oh, but now we want something on the right. And then we have to change our grid and update all of these values. So we can do a little bit better. The numbering's tricky, and it's a little bit fragile. So this is where we can use named areas. Now this is going to look weird. but roll with me. Essentially what you do here is make an ASCII art version of your layout. So I'm saying nav, 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 aside content A, content B, aside content C, D, footer, footer, footer. So when I'm repeating each of those keywords there, I'm telling it to do that 3 times. So my template columns is 3, so I'm telling it use all 3. I know it looks strange that you have to repeat it. You can use emojis if you want, by the way. So if you just really want to make it weird, you can do that. But all I have to do in my areas now is just say grid area nav, or grid area aside, or grid area footer, and it will fill that area. And so if you think about what that could do for you, if a new column comes along, you just change this to say nav, 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 aside content A, content B, right thingy, aside content C, content D, right thingy, footer, footer, footer. And we've been able to just change our entire thing, and all of these guys don't care that it's changed. They're just still going to fill their area. They're going to find it and they're going to fill into that. So you can have amazing flexibility with your layout. And if you think about responsiveness now, if I was to put this on a mobile, often the thing that happens is we just stack it all on top of each other. I think this will again improve with Grid, and phones are massive too. So I've just said nav aside A, B, C, D, footer. And then all of them, I haven't had to do anything else. None of the other code has changed. I've just redefined my area. So it's one of those really, I think, exciting parts of what this brings to that. I did change the columns there as well, just to be one fraction. But yeah, it gives you a really flexible approach to this. But what do you think? It looks strange writing your interface like that? Generally, it looks a bit weird. It does. But you'll get used to it. It's one of those things that the benefits of that far outweigh anything else with the simplicity of it. And something that people at work were telling me is actually getting that visual of what the layout looks like in just a little square box is actually quite handy. They're like, oh, okay, it's the nav here, this is here, these are here, and they run across. It was quite useful. I guess the limitation of the areas is that you're defining your entire interface in one sort of go. There is flexibility there, but you are sort of limiting yourself to what you set up there. So this gets a little bit meta, but you can name each, earlier when I was talking about the lines, I said that you can refer to them by name or number. So now we're going to start naming the lines. And so this is an interface, ignore the code first. So this is an interface that again you'll have run into where you'll have the thing at the top, let's say it's a blog post, your content running down the middle and a footer or something at the bottom. And inevitably you'll want maybe a bit of bleed at the side in the content, you know, something a bit more exciting to make an image just pop out to the side, or do something interesting like that. We've all sort of seen that on various websites. And it gets a bit tricky. We need to start breaking up our containers. We need to wrap things just to get that going. Now, again, the HTML is the same for all of these. And what I've done is name the columns. So this is just the columns going across. You give it a name at the start and at each of the points along the grid and a size of that. And then you can say full start to full end. So that's cell number 1. It's the one at the top. So it stretches to the full width of that thing. When I demonstrated this at work, I had a very similar reaction of people just going, that makes no sense. So I'm going to jump across to this image here, which I don't know if it helps. So here's the breakdown of those lines, ignoring the grid. We've got the full start, the container start is there, center, container end in there. We're just going along that way. So you're just doing it row by row going down. And so that gives you a lot of flexibility just to keep flowing and making your layout dynamic as you move down the page. So you're not limited to, say, the areas are amazing, but then you can, in this instance, make it very dynamic and fluid as you're going down the page. All right, so here's an example of that. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so it's one of those things I think you need to play with it to fully grasp what it is doing. If you'll notice this naming system that I'm using of start, end, so prefix something, start, end. You can name those whatever you like. It doesn't have to follow that standard. If you do follow that standard of start, end, and there's matching rows, Grid will automatically give you the area of the same name. So if you look at number 1 here, I've given it the grid area of main. I haven't needed to use the slashes and all of that. It's because these match up with it. It's got a start, it's got an end, it's got a start, and it's got an end. So Grid's automatically going, oh, okay, this is an area. I can just put it into here. So you can essentially use both approaches together there. So support for this is not too bad. Right? You can't just go full YOLO and get rid of Flexbox or anything like that. That would be nice. But you can start to use it, right? It's Opera Mini. I swear it's always red when I look at this website. And then the others, there's a good amount of green in here, right? There's a bit of prefixing here. Everyone else is just, it's either there or not, right? So you're going to have some backups when you use this. And there's a few options for that. There's definitely no polyfill with this. It's too complex. There's too many bits and pieces in there to make a polyfill. I think the browser would just crash. So what I've used when I've been using this in the past is @support. So you know that if it supports Grid, that it will support the @supports tag. And then that you test for Grid. So you have your fallback code, likely in Flex or whatever it is that you choose to use. And then from there, you will write your Grid code to overwrite that, basically. What I've been seeing Stripe doing, they've been doing a lot of work in this, is they're loading the fallbacks with JS. And that's probably really good for Stripe because they have a very technical audience, I think. The benefit of JS loading it in is obviously that you don't have all the CSS in one file. If, like where I work, you don't necessarily have the most technical-minded people accessing those sites, I think it's better to probably give that extra weight to the CSS and make sure that your site at least looks nice no matter what, and there's not that delay or they've got JavaScript turn off or an issue. If you're in a company that you don't necessarily need to worry about some of those older browsers and you can do this, then that's awesome too. It's really up to you on that one, what you do. So a bit of further reading on Grid, and that is basically anything by Rachel Andrew. She's really spearheaded this stuff. She's got books, talks, blogs, but especially gridbyexample.com. This has layouts of everything that you can imagine with Grid, already done, already set up with, you know, versions with using areas or name lines or anything like that. And she's got it. Wes Boss is releasing a free course on this, and he covers a lot of that not needing media queries approach with auto and auto fit. And then he just tweeted today that it's going to be released tomorrow, which is handy because you're all really inspired now to go and have a look at that. I said it was free, didn't I? I did. So yeah, that will be worth having a look at. Another one is Mozilla put out a really good guide that just runs you through it. I had the hardest time with the named lines originally. I just didn't understand how that was working. So you've just got to play with it and you will see the benefits of it. And hopefully I have shown you some of the benefits of using Grid. So like Mandy, all the examples are up on CodePen there, so you can play around with them. And as I said, I'm on the Fenders Slack if you have any questions about that. So thanks.